25 movies, 13 years, an incredible saga, and Marvel's Eternals is finally here to bring you sex. So last night I checked out Eternals with the girlfriend. I was actually not expecting to watch it, really, because up until that point, the trailers, they were good, but they just weren't developing the level of hype that was necessarily bringing me to the theater, especially with the pandemic still kind of going on, even though, things are slightly looking better. But over time, and after realizing that my girlfriend ended up getting the day off, really, from work, and that's honestly, in the time that we're at right now with the way things are working at her place, that's actually kind of a relief. It was kind of a godsend. So I figured, you know what? Let's bite the bullet. Let's go check out Marvel's Eternals, despite the seats not being where we like them to be in the theater reserve seating format. But nevertheless, we checked it out in IMAX at 7 o'clock Thursday night, so we were one of the first ones to kind of catch it amongst the public. And we went in there with very guarded preconceptions, because yes, after a while, this movie was being talked about in the most negative way possible for a Marvel movie, specifically after its Rotten Tomatoes score was revealed and everyone was going, oh my god, it's getting a 50-something% to 61%, 66%. It's the lowest rated MCU movie on Rotten Tomatoes. How can this possibly be? I can't go on. No, I can't. Oh god. I liked it. Yeah, walking out of it, I was like, you know what? Yeah, if there was one seminal example of a movie that you simply just need to go watch and build an opinion for yourself, whether you liked it or disliked it, this is probably one of the best recent examples that I'm going to look at and go, yeah, when it comes to Rotten Tomatoes, you could be swayed one way or another, but ultimately the final piece of the puzzle, the final factor, the final element that's needed to then make you decide whether or not you like this movie is to actually go and watch the movie. Because after walking out of it, I thought to myself, yeah, is this a great movie? No. But I thought it was good. I liked it. I thought that there were so many elements of it that were very different from the typical MCU film, which is an often huge criticism that a lot of people have with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is that after a while, especially going into this phase 4, people were thinking like, oh, we got to change the formula, we got to change the template. Marvel has always had this template of how their movies work, and yet when a movie finally does that, people are like, oh, this is too weird, too boring, too slow. It's a little over 2.5 hours. How can they possibly have made this? It's bloated up. And I'm gonna tell you guys right now, I had a better time sitting through this than I even did Dune. And that's not just me saying that because I'm a Marvel bitch. I thought Black Widow was okay, Shang-Chi a little bit better, but still not quite hitting the mark. And now here I am thinking that Eternals was actually the better one of the phase 4 so far. And that's because seeing this team of Eternals actually come together and make me root for them was something that I just wasn't expecting myself to feel for, considering that the trailers gave me this worry. And this worry was that these characters are these devout, or rather divine beings, dedicated to overlooking humanity and making sure that humanity is on the right course after thousands of years of living on Earth, making sure that civilizations thrived for a specific purpose. And that in and of itself, combined with the way that the movie opens with a title crawl a la Apocalypse Now, I'm like, ugh. Whenever a movie opens with this title crawl, you better be epic. Otherwise, you're gonna draw out your mythology and just kind of, meander its way into its own mythology that's just gonna lose me. But even 20 minutes in, I was like, you know what? I'm actually vibing with a little bit of the pacing of this movie. I'm vibing with the characters. The characters don't feel so like melancholic and very like because with these kind of characters, it's very easy for them to be a little bit too all-powerful, a little bit too divine in their state, and come off as boring, come off as two-dimensional, and just being like, I am the Eternal, you know what I mean? And they never did. After centuries of being on Earth, you can notice that at the beginning they probably were like that. You kind of see shades of that at the beginning, but then over the course of the centuries, they learned to adapt the cultures of the world over Europe. During the time when the continents were together during Pangea. thousands before BC, BC and all that stuff. So you kind of see the evolution, even if it's done in little segments, because it kind of cuts back between the past and the present. And you see these characters become compelling for who they are with each of their individual powers, but also with each of their individual personalities. Some you're gonna prefer over the others, because there's gonna be some that you can look at and be like, oh, that's badass. And there's others that are just not gonna be your cup of tea, but all of them still brought a feeling of a compelling nature that I just was not expecting for these kind of characters. I was expecting them to be boring and the movie itself to be boring, and I was never really bored. Could it have been trimmed a little, because it does strike that 157-minute mark, and trust me, that sounds like a difficult pill to swallow upon hearing it. Going after a while though, I started to feel the length just a little bit, but like I mentioned before, lesser so than I did with Dune. And Dune, I was actually starting to trail off to where I had to like shake myself a little bit awake, especially towards the end. With this movie, I was actually in it for the ride. I just saw moments where I can feel like the 1 minute mark hit, or the 1 hour mark hit, or the 2 hour mark hit. And not just because I had to, kind of tell myself that to then let my girlfriend know that she needed to take her sleeping pill to wake up early in the morning the next day for work, but also because I just started to kind of feel that and detect those moments. And if the movie's doing that, then the length can kind of be felt in hindsight. But the movie's not perfect, and like I mentioned before, there's a couple of things that the MCU has been criticized for a while, even harkening back to phase 1, and one of those things was actually the villains. And I can see that a little bit here, except for one little twisty detail that I'm not going to go into detail because of spoilers, even though there's been some leaks out there already. But let's just say that there's a bit of a divide amongst the villains introduced in this movie, one of which does feed into the criticism of being kind of bland and monotonous and just being the archetypal villain that says, I will destroy you all, or you cannot save them, or do things like that. And I was just like, all right, when is this guy gonna go out? But then another I was not necessarily expecting, considering how slightly detached I am from the source material, and because of that, I was like, you know what? I'm actually pretty vibing with this. You caught me by surprise with this one. I have to give you credit. But one other criticism that I'm starting to see just a little bit is one that's actually not been there since phase 1, but I feel like coursing through phase 2 and 3, I've been hearing a lot more people kind of bring up, and that is how certain Marvel films or certain scenes in Marvel films have a tendency to be a little too funny or a little too snarky and sarcastic when it doesn't really call for it. And up until this point, I feel like tones have been consistent across the board from beginning to end of some of these films. But when it comes to Eternals, because of the way that director Chloe Zhao, who's coming off the success of Nomadland, winning Best Director and Best Picture, and you could definitely sense her style watching the entire movie, whether it be from the acute camera angles, how she kind of films things off the side, as well as her utilization of natural light. There's so many scenes that are beautifully shot because of its use of light, or lack thereof, because of the natural course of action taken with cinematographer Ben Davis, who's kind of a mainstay with Marvel. He did, I think, Doctor Strange and the first Guardians of the Galaxy, and he along with Chloe Zhao are able to kind of utilize a very good knack for detail amongst the way things are designed and lit and shot from various angles, especially when you take into account the Celestials and things that have to do with that much more astrological background of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And whenever that's brought in, it is a wonder to behold, especially if you are watching this movie in IMAX. But at times, that traditional Marvel humor kind of pierces some of these much more serious and beautiful moments in a way that did feel a little obvious to me, that didn't bug me as much as it does other people, but it definitely made me think of those people's criticisms and made me go, okay, all these other movies were tonally consistent. This one has moments where it's going for a much different approach as far as the way something is shot, like I mentioned, with the natural lighting as opposed to the very artificial lighting that other Marvel movies have had, with the way that a lot of scenes are shot on location versus a green screen, and the approach is just very different. So when that traditional Marvel humor comes in, especially when a certain character gets rethrown back into the cast of characters and gets kind of indoctrinated into the story, all of a sudden it's just joke after joke after joke that even I was like, okay, we can kind of stretch these out, especially when that character then brings along another character that's meant for comic relief, and I'm like, do we really need two of you right now? I think we could do with just one. We could really use a little bit of a spacing going on right here, especially when we just had some serious news being broken, and this character then turns around to have a visual gag right in front of him. And that's where it kind of finally sunk into me that, yeah, this little problem that people have had with Marvel's humor finally kind of transcended with me in this movie. And that's only because of how much different the tone and the setting and the actual approach to this material was done by Chloe Zhao. So that's why ultimately I walked away thinking that I really loved the uniqueness of this movie with its diverse cast and the approach to the material, the way it's shot, the way it definitely feels like a separated MCU. But when the movie then infuses those traditional MCU trappings, especially in the humor or in some of that pacing in the middle, that's when I was thinking to myself, okay, it's definitely an imperfect film. It's definitely not great. I wouldn't put it upon the same tier as something like Avengers Endgame, or the first Doctor Strange, or the first Iron Man, Thor Ragnarok, etc., or even Black Panther, or the first Guardians of the Galaxy. But it is still a very good Marvel movie. It's probably my favorite out of Phase 4 thus far, and it's most definitely not a 50-something% or even the 60-something% on Rotten Tomatoes. This worse than Thor the Dark World? No, I'm sorry, but even I have to, at the very least, subjectively say that that cannot be. And if you guys don't believe me, I'd say check out the movie for yourself in theaters now. Otherwise, wait for it to drop on Disney Plus and then develop your own opinion. It's at least worth the try.